We got NFL news and notes with John McMullen from 97.3 ESPN.com and FanRag Sports NFL, where some Eagles news today and other NFL news and notes. This is funny. Who had a better NBA trade deadline, PT? 88% said Sam Hinkie, 12% say Colangelo. That's pretty funny. John McMullen joins us here on the Sports Bash.
Looks like I'm not going to have to throw out that jersey, MG.
What's that?
Of all the jerseys that I could have bought a couple of years ago, I decided to go out and get Peters. I got a Peters jersey.
Jason Peters.
Might not have to throw that out.
Right, John, it looks like the Eagles and Jason Peters have decided to let's have a kumbaya, and you can continue to make your $10 million, and we'll go figure out other ways to save money.
Yeah, and I never thought the Eagles were going to move on from Jason Peters. I think the hope was that they could move some money around and maybe extend the deal so you could sort of spread that guaranteed money over a couple seasons and create a little salary cap space. But they've decided to go in a different direction. They didn't have a ton of leverage. So as I wrote on 973ESPN.com, it doesn't hurt to ask, but they didn't have leverage. And Jason said, no, I'll take my money. Thank you very much. And the Eagles are going to have to create salary cap space somewhere else because, hey, he's 35 years old. I know people get frustrated with the false starts occasionally, but he still played at a very high level last season, was one of the Eagles' best players. And that's not the way to rebuild a team with a young quarterback by taking away a top-tier left tackle. And the Eagles, to their credit, they understood that. Doug Peterson was very upfront and said he wanted him back. Howie Roseman said he wanted him back. So it wasn't like they were thinking about releasing him. They just wanted to move some money around, and it didn't work out.
John, how do they go about doing that, clearing up money?
Well, you still have a number of shoes left to fall. Connor Barwin, Ryan Matthews is certainly going to be released at some point. Those would be the two biggest. And then you have to discuss the potentials of some of the other offensive linemen, most notably Jason Kelsey and Alan Barber, if they want to pay them moving forward. So those are the biggest names. I would say definitely Ryan's gone. There's no question about it. Connor, the best case scenario for him he would have to be back on a restructured deal, and I doubt that. So most likely he's going to be gone, and then the more difficult discussions start with players like Kelsey and Barber, and even Dorial Green-Beckham. It's not a lot of money, but they could move on from him, and that would create an extra $1 million. So there's still a number of things that are still going to be taking place before March 9th.
Yeah, Jason Peters. So Peters says, no, I'm not restructuring. And as Pete just says, all right, if Peters says no, what's the next step? What's the trickle-down effect? I mean, does this change any of their off-season strategy? Were they kind of anticipating Peters saying, yeah, sure, I'll work with you here?
Yeah, even if they were, it was only going to be a couple $1 million maybe gained under the cap. So it wasn't going to be a huge shift. So I don't think it affects their plans dramatically. And I think that's why they moved on from it so quickly and said, all right, we're not going to worry about it at this stage and just start moving forward in other directions and trying to make more difficult decisions. So either way, it wasn't going to make a terrific difference. It was certainly anything when you're up against the cap as closely as the Eagles are helps. That's why I brought up DGB, because $1 million is $1 million, but anything could help, and it would have helped, but not in a sense where they could go out and sign, 3 high-level free agents instead of 1. That's not the kind of deal we were talking about.
John, how disappointed were the Eagles in Dorial Green-Beckham? You mentioned him as a possible cut.
Well, I think they're disappointed in their entire receiving corps, to be honest. Even to a certain degree, Jordan Matthews. But certainly, I think they found out why Tennessee was willing to trade him, in the fact that, you know, he looks like $1 million and he fits the suit, and then he gets on the field and he doesn't play like a 6'5", 240-pound receiver. He doesn't fight for balls. He's not very physical, despite the fact that he could dominate defensive backs. And I think they realized that. And it was, you know, it was a shot in the dark. You take a guy with tremendous physical skills, who had a number of issues at college, had a number of issues in Nashville, and you try to get him into a new program and maybe grows up and maybe develops a work ethic. And I just don't think it happened. And I think the Eagles are considering moving on.
Yeah, you know, DGB, as you kind of mentioned, he fits the suit, but it just doesn't seem that he has what's he missing? The passion, the ticker. What is it? What is he lacking?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I hate to say people don't try, because he's certainly out there in practice giving a nice effort on a daily basis. But for whatever reason, he doesn't play the way he should play. I mean, when you see a guy with his size, you want a Michael Irvin type receiver. You want a guy who's going to be really, really physical. And he doesn't play like that. And we constantly talked about it during the season. Why don't the Eagles throw fade patterns to DGB? Well, he doesn't go up and get the ball and compete. So, you know, that's probably a question that needs to be answered by a sports psychologist. And if the Titans or the Eagles could have figured it out, they would have certainly done it. There's just an innate thing about certain guys who are so competitive. It drives them, and we haven't seen that from a player like DGB to this point in his career.
No, he was disappointing, I think, for all of us. I think, you know, you get a guy who, you know, he was a pretty heralded player coming into the league, too. You know, he had some problems in college, but he had that whole number one player in the country, you know, problems, and then he comes into the league as a guy who many, right, John, perceive that slipped in the draft, and you always feel like, oh, well, we're the team that has the guy that, you know, Randy Moss was one of those guys, but he was Randy Moss, even though he slipped. He fell all the way down to the Vikings at like 18th or something. Here's a guy, that guy should have been taken number one. And then you're kind of thinking, oh, do we have that kind of guy? Is DGB that guy that slips because of his attitude and maybe something becomes of him? And now you're seeing that, he's not that special of a player.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. If he didn't have any issues at Missouri, if he got to Oklahoma even and played, you're talking about a guy whose skill set would have probably made him a top 10 pick in the draft. I mean, that's how gifted he is physically. And, yeah, anytime you get a player sort of buy low and low risk, high reward, maybe you can tap into something. And as I said, maybe he matures and the light goes off. Unfortunately, we didn't see any evidence of that. And while I say that, I still think he's a better receiver than Nelson Aguilar. But unfortunately, from the financial perspective, the Eagles really can't move on from Nelson Aguilar. It would cost them more to cut him than to keep him, whereas DGB is a second-round pick. His contract, they can actually garner some money back. So I it's one of those things. You have to improve at the position, and to improve at the position, you have to create some opportunity. And Matthews is going to be there. Aguilar is going to be there. So who's the most logical to go? It would be DGB.
John McMullen's with us, NFL News and Notes here, Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. Let's look at some NFL news. You have kind of stated that you think Peterson will move on. The Vikings today, kind of indicating they have not talked about his $18 million deal. They were very non-committal when talking about Adrian Peterson today.
Well, yeah, there's nothing to talk about as far as $18 million. I mean, Rick Spielman is, as you mentioned, he spoke today, and he's going to be political about it, and that's, I think, what you saw happen. But everybody in Minnesota knows they're not going to pay him $18 million. Adrian Peterson knows that. So a lot of it is in his court. We've talked about in the past, he's a descending player. He doesn't do a lot as far as pass protection, as far as catching the football out of the backfield. So he's limited in that way. He's going to have to take a lot less money to play. And for a guy who's that good, who's been that good, that's a very prideful thing. And sometimes it's difficult. And I could even see, and we haven't mentioned this, but I would say the same thing with Jay Cutler at the quarterback position, who's not nearly as accomplished as Peterson. There's at least a small chance that Peterson just walks away and retires and says, I don't want to play for $5 or $6 million. And so you have to throw that into the equation.
Also, a lot of news out of Minnesota today. Rick Spielman have a press conference or something? All this Minnesota news is coming out, but
he had a press conference there.
Random, odd. No comment basically on Bradford. On his contract situation, because it sounds like we're talking about a Sam Bradford contract almost yearly. He's due to make $17 million in salary and bonuses this particular year. But if Minnesota puts him out there, he gets guaranteed money in 2018 again. I mean, so they've got some investment in him. He says he makes that deal in a millisecond again, no doubt, which is, interesting. But what is Sam Bradford's future with Minnesota? It sounds odd to say that, but another year behind Sam. And if we remember, he signed a very short-term deal to stay in Philadelphia last year.
Yeah, I mean, he's the starting quarterback of the Vikings, and the realization, I think a lot of it is also political in that aspect, because they have a lot of respect for Teddy Bridgewater, who's currently rehabilitating, but he's not going to be back next season. That's the reality, and he may never be back. So I think part of it is they don't want to sort of rain on Teddy's parade and say Sam's our unequivocal long-term starter. But I think from the franchise's perspective, if Sam plays the way he did last season, again next season, he's going to be the Vikings' long-term starter. And they'll work something out as far as the contract goes, because the last thing Sam knows, he's bouncing around. He would love to have some continuity with the coaching staff and stick with Pat Shurmur. So from that standpoint, I don't think it's an issue. And he's the Viking starter. So I think that's where it comes from, that he'd make the deal in a millisecond again. And Howie Roseman would make the deal even quicker than that. So it depends what side of the coin you're looking at it from.
Yeah, I think the Eagles are probably thrilled with that move, looking back, because they're preparing for the 14th or 15th pick in the draft. Meanwhile, Minnesota out of the first round. So that trade really, worked out well for both teams, right? I mean, you look back and say Minnesota loses its starting quarterback.
Yeah, it did. Sam played very well. You have to give him credit. And things didn't work out as a whole for Minnesota, but that didn't have much to do with the way Sam played. In fact, it probably would have been much worse. Not probably, would have been. But just all the offensive line issues, the Peterson injury, it could have been really, really bad. And he saved it in being sort of a 500 season, which is not great when you start 5-0 and you think you're a Super Bowl contender. But I think after you take a step back and get away from the emotion of it, the Vikings kind of realize what Sam did for them. And it's the rare trade that worked out for both sides. But I would still say, from the Eagles' perspective, it's a home run, because Sam wasn't in their plans. So they got the 14th or 15th pick in the draft, as you mentioned, Mike, for a guy who wasn't going to be here. And that is tremendous return something the Sixers might want to learn from. It's my Sixers shot for you.
John McMullen with us, our Eagles insider,
Easy guy, easy.
FanRagSports.com. Put on you. I did see, this is for you, John. I did see the tweet that said that Chip Kelly was spotted leaving the Sixers office, taking off a Brian Colangelo mask. So I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
See what happens when the Sixers go and hire a basketball guy, those fools.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm an equal opportunity basher. I think the Sixers are a dreadful organization, and things haven't changed much with Brian Colangelo from Sam Hinkie. But I will say real quick, Sixers fans drastically, I put this on Twitter, overvalue Nerlens Noel and Jahlil Okafor. They're not valued around the NBA. You just got to come to grips with it.
John McMullen with us. A little NBA talk in the middle of our NFL talk. Let's get back to the National Football League, Johnny Mack, and the reports that Kansas City is interested in Tony Romo. What does that say about Alex Smith?
Yeah, Kansas City's in a tough spot. They're a very, very good football team. Obviously, tremendous record over the last 2 seasons. But I think the feeling there is they've kind of maxed out and reached their peak with Alex Smith. So you could do a lot worse than Alex Smith, but when you're a team that thinks you should be in the Super Bowl hunt and you want to reach for that brass ring, you got to get better at that position. And it's difficult for good teams to get better at the quarterback position. This is one of those rare occasions because of the way things have shaken out in Dallas. You have a veteran quarterback who's played very well in the past, and if he wants to be with a Super Bowl contender, that's a logical spot for him. So it's something you have to think about, and you have to think about long and hard if you're the Kansas City Chiefs, because if Tony Romo's healthy, he could put them in a conversation to being a legitimate Super Bowl contender.
Yeah, that's an interesting one for me because, Alex Smith, he's the guy that you say, I can win games with Alex Smith, but can I win a Super Bowl? Like, I think that's the crossroads they are at right now, right? Where they're just like, hey, we keep winning 10, 11, 12 games, and we keep getting bounced in the first round, and I think if you looked at the Final Four, the NFL is almost becoming the NBA. If you don't have the superstar player in the NBA, you're not winning. And if you don't have the superstar quarterback now, you're not winning. You might have a really good team, but you're not going to win the Super Bowl with just the guy, that's not that – like that's what the Final Four of this year's NFL was, right? You had Roethlisberger, you had, obviously Brady, Matt Ryan,
Aaron Rodgers, yeah.
Yeah, so
you had the MVP, you had the guy who's probably playing better than anybody else, and Rodgers, the greatest quarterback of all time, and Tom Brady, and Ben Roethlisberger's already won 2 Super Bowls. And I think you hit the nail on the head. That's where the Chiefs are. They think, Alex Smith, as you said, he's good enough to win a lot of games with when they have a great supporting cast like they do, but he can't get him over the hump. And I think that's why they're having the conversations. If we can get this guy, if he's healthy, there's a lot of ifs there. If you can get him under a decent salary cap number, all these things come into play. But if you're the Chiefs and the window's open, you almost have to try to get through it.
I like Romo. For me, I think Houston is the fit. The money is not the fit, though, right? That's the problem there. That Osweiler deal, does that prevent him from going? Because I think Houston has the defense. They've got the receiver. They've got, Miller. They got a nice running game. Their quarterback, I mean, there's 4 of us in having a Josh, me, you, Pete. They could pick one of us, and we'd probably get just as far.
Yeah, I mean, they had the number 1 defense in the NFL without J.J. Watt.
Right.
And J.J.
So is Houston
healthy.
Is Houston almost a better spot than Denver?
Yeah, probably because of that defense, because it's in Texas as well, so we get to stay close to home. That's part of it. They have some pieces in place on offense as well. She mentioned DeAndre Hopkins, also Will Fuller, who's a great deep threat or projects to be. But the problem is they owe Brock Osweiler $19 million, and they can't get out of it until 2018, and they will. But that's very difficult to do. Now, you can do it. There's nothing against the law that says you can't pay a backup quarterback $19 million, except you're going to look embarrassing.
Well, they did it this year. For a couple games until who was the other schmuckbag?
Got in trouble. Tom Savage.
How could you forget the Rutgers quarterback?
College. Yeah, Rutgers, Pitt, Arizona. He played at 3 different Division I colleges.
He sucked at them all.
Be careful when you say Pitt to Mike Gill, John. He usually has another word that rhymes with Pitt.
Yeah.
We can't say on the radio.
The FCC would be mad at me. Tom Savage at 3 colleges, sucked at all 3 of them, and now he stinks in the NFL too.
But he's better than Brock Osweiler. You could argue that at least. But I always said the biggest indictment of Brock Osweiler, I never heard John Gruden say a bad word about any quarterback on television except Brock Osweiler.
John McMullen, at JF McMullen on Twitter as the NFL. I saw Albert Breer tweet out the 30, I guess they're top 22 salaries, and you would be happy to know that Sam Bradford makes 17.5, John. That's ranked 20th in the league among quarterbacks.
Yeah, it's a going rate, and I think people constantly, I always talk about it, and they see these big numbers. Tyrod Taylor's a perfect example.
$18 million.
They talk about how could you guarantee him $27.5 million over the next 2 years. That's a bargain for a starting quarterback in this league.
Yeah.
So
Tyrod Taylor, $18 million. Romo, $18 million. Osweiler, $18 million. Those are 16th, 17th. They're tied for 16th essentially. Stafford, 17.7. Bradford, 17.5. Alex Smith, 17, and then Andy Dalton. There's 22 quarterbacks that make more than $16 million a year. Andy Dalton is 22nd with $16 million.
Yes, the cost of doing business at that position in the NFL is really $18 million because Bradford and Osweiler said it last year. And that's where Washington made the mistake. Should have got it done long-term with Kirk Cousins, and now look at the quandary they're in. They got to franchise him again. They got to guarantee him near $24 million, all because they balked at $18 million a year. They could have had a long-term deal at $18 million per year, and they messed up.
All right, John McMullen, tomorrow we'll have more NFL news and notes as we do every day at this time as the Sports Bash rolls on this NBA trade deadline Thursday where Nerlens Noel is out, Jahlil Okafor is in, and it looks like Jason Peters will be staying a member of the Philadelphia Eagles. For more on that story, go to 97.3 ESPN.com. Thanks, John.
Hey, thanks, guys.